In the quiet, snow-covered town of Willow Creek, a little girl's desperate plea echoed in the dark. "Just one spoon, please. My brother hasn't eaten in 3 days." What happened next would change everything. A father's return, a loyal German shepherd's courage, and a family's fight for survival. This is not just a story about pain. It's about hope, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between love and loyalty. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. I'd love to know. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story. And may your day be filled with warmth and light. Winter pressed down heavily on Willow Creek, a small mountain town tucked between ridges of pine and shale where storms often lingered for days. That night, the sky was iron gray and snow had begun to fall again, coating rooftops and burying the narrow road in silence. Street lamps struggled to cast light through the flakes, halos blurred by the storm. The Bennett house sat at the far edge of town, its paint faded, its chimney smoking faintly against the sky. Inside, the kitchen glowed under a single buzzing bulb, the sound of the storm muffled but ever present, rattling the windows like an impatient guest. On the cracked linoleum floor knelt Clara Bennett, 9 years old, her knees pressed into the cold surface, her chestnut brown hair falling from braids that had been hurriedly tied hours earlier. She had a thin frame, made thinner by neglect, her sweater oversized, the elbows worn thin. Her hazel eyes, large and haunted, carried both defiance and resignation, the look of a child who had learned too early that safety was fragile. She cradled her baby brother against her chest, her voice hoarse but desperate. "Please, just one spoon. He hasn't eaten for 3 days." The infant was Samuel Bennett, barely a year old, feverish in her arms. His skin flushed red with heat, his breath shallow, his eyelids heavy. Samuel's blanket was threadbare, patched with crude stitches Clara had made herself from scraps. He whimpered, a sound so faint it seemed to dissolve in the air. The weight of his frailty settled like a stone on Clara's small shoulders, but she held him tighter, rocking gently, as though her embrace could shield him from the hunger and the cold. Across the kitchen stood Veronica Hale, Clara's stepmother. Veronica was 42, heavy-set, her auburn curls stiff with hairspray, her lips painted in a garish red that cracked in the corners when she scowled. She carried herself as though she were above the faded house, her jewelry flashy though cheaply made, her movements sharp and theatrical. Years earlier, Veronica had worked as a bank secretary where she learned the power of appearances. But her ambition soured into bitterness after failed relationships and financial missteps. She had long grown resentful of children who reminded her of sacrifices she never wanted to make. Veronica's temper was her weapon, honed through years of bending others with raised voices and threats. Tonight, her pale green eyes narrowed at Clara with disdain. "You ungrateful little brat," she snapped, her voice shrill. "I said he doesn't need that much milk. You want to waste it all?" She snatched the glass bottle from the counter, her thick fingers gripping it tight, then hurled it down against the floor. It shattered, pieces scattering like ice, milk spilling in pale rivers across the linoleum. The sound echoed through the small kitchen like a cruel punctuation. Clara flinched, tightening her hold on Samuel as his small body jolted in fright. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks, her lips trembling as she whispered again, "Please, he's so hungry." Her voice barely rose above the hum of the light bulb, but the plea carried the weight of despair. Veronica sneered, crossing her arms, her silhouette blocking the dim light from the doorway. "You think crying will change anything? Your father spoiled you, but I won't. This house is mine now, and you'll obey or you'll regret it." It was then a low growl rippled through the room. From the shadow of the hallway stepped a German shepherd, a black and silver male around 5 years old, his frame lean but muscular, his coat thick against the winter cold. His ears stood tall, his amber eyes fixed on Veronica, glowing with an intensity that made the air heavy. A faint scar ran along his right flank, an old wound that hinted at fights survived. The dog had no collar, no clear owner, but he had been appearing at the Bennett yard for weeks, drawn by something only he understood. Clara had whispered a name for him, Ranger, because he seemed to patrol the boundaries of her world with vigilance. Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating in his chest, hackles raised as his gaze locked on Veronica. He stepped forward, his claws clicking softly on the linoleum, body poised between predator and guardian. Veronica startled, then snarled, seizing a broom from the corner. "Get out, you filthy mutt!" She swung it through the air, but Ranger did not flinch. His stance was unyielding, his amber eyes never leaving hers, as though he could see through her painted exterior to the rot beneath. Clara's tears slowed just slightly at the sight of him. She whispered into Samuel's damp hair, "It's okay, Sammy. Ranger's here." The words were fragile, but carried a spark of hope. Samuel whimpered, nuzzling closer against her chest, his fevered breath dampening her sweater. Outside, the storm rattled harder against the windows, the wind pressing like a giant's hand against the fragile walls. The house creaked, milk spread across the floor. Shards glittered in the dim light, and the scene held. A cruel woman with fury in her painted lips, a child kneeling with her brother, and a stray who had chosen to stand as their shield. Ranger's bark broke the silence then, sharp and commanding, echoing like a vow. Veronica hesitated, broom raised but wavering, her lips curling as her authority faltered. Clara clutched Samuel tighter, rocking him gently, whispering through chattering teeth, "Hold on, Sammy, hold on." In that dim kitchen, beneath the storm's howl, love and cruelty stood face to face. And though no rescue had yet come, something had shifted. The children were not alone. The storm still rolled across Willow Creek like an unbroken tide. Snow hissed against street lamps, piling along sidewalks and silent dunes. Officer Nathan Bennett's patrol cruiser cut through the night, chains rattling against the tires, headlights slashing arcs through the swirling white. Nathan, 38, sat rigid behind the wheel, his storm-gray eyes narrowed in concentration. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, his uniform snug across muscles hardened by years of service. Dark hair streaked early with gray was cropped short, his jaw rough with stubble. He carried the weariness of a man who had buried his wife too soon and built walls of silence around himself. Grief had narrowed his life to work and duty, leaving little space for tenderness, though his children remained the one anchor holding him steady. As the cruiser rolled up to his house on the edge of town, Nathan noticed the faint glow of the kitchen window. He expected warmth, but what greeted him instead was the sound of shattering glass. His instincts sharpened instantly. He shoved the door open, boots crunching over snow, and stormed inside. The kitchen froze into a tableau. Clara knelt on the floor clutching Samuel, her cheeks streaked with tears. Milk pooled across the linoleum. Shards of glass glittered in the dim light. Veronica stood with a broom in hand, her painted lips twisted into fury. And there, between child and woman, stood Ranger, hackles raised, amber eyes blazing, his body braced to defend. Nathan's voice cracked through the room, deep and commanding. "What's going on here?" Veronica startled, but quickly attempted to recover her poise. "She's lying again. The boy doesn't need that much milk. She's wasting it." "Enough!" Nathan's roar shook the walls, his fists clenched at his sides, veins throbbing in his forearms. He strode forward, snow still clinging to his uniform, and glared down at her with eyes cold as steel. For years, Veronica had wielded her temper like a whip, but now, faced with Nathan's fury, she faltered. Clara's sob broke the silence. "Papa, he's so hot. He can't breathe right." She pressed Samuel tighter against her chest. Nathan bent and took the infant gently, his large hands trembling as he felt the fever radiating from his son's body. The baby whimpered weakly, his tiny fists curling. The sound struck Nathan like a blade. Ranger barked once, sharp and resolute, then pressed against Nathan's leg as though urging him to act. Nathan turned back to Veronica, his jaw hard. "You will not touch them again. Pack your things. You're finished here." Veronica's face blanched, then flushed crimson. Her voice rose shrill with desperation. "You can't just throw me out, after everything I've done for this family." "You've done enough," Nathan cut her off, his voice like a gunshot. He turned away from her entirely, cradling Samuel in one arm and reaching for Clara with the other. The little girl clutched his sleeve, her eyes wide with both fear and relief. From the hallway emerged Mrs. Lillian Hayes, the elderly neighbor who had come to deliver a basket of firewood earlier and stayed to escape the storm. She was a widow in her 70s, short and wiry, her white hair tucked beneath a knitted cap, her hands stiff from arthritis but steady. She had raised 3 children of her own decades ago and carried the quiet resilience of a woman who had survived both poverty and loss. She took in the scene silently, her lips pressed thin. She had long suspected the cruelty inside the Bennett house, but had lacked proof. Now her sharp blue eyes narrowed on Veronica, judgment heavy. Nathan brushed past them, heading for the door. "I'm taking my children to the hospital," he said, without looking back. "When I return, you will be gone." Outside, the storm battered harder, snow swirling in sheets. Nathan opened the cruiser's back door and set Clara and Samuel gently inside. Clara held her brother close, whispering his name like a prayer. Ranger leapt into the passenger seat, fur dusted with snow, eyes alert as ever. Nathan slid behind the wheel, slammed the door, and started the engine. The headlights pierced the night once more as they pulled from the driveway, the house shrinking behind them. Veronica's silhouette lingered at the window, but Nathan did not look back. His focus was on the fragile breaths of his son, the trembling shoulders of his daughter, and the growl of the dog who refused to abandon them. The cruiser surged into the storm, tires sliding across icy patches, wipers screeching against the windshield. Nathan's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. His voice dropped low, trembling but fierce. "Hold on, Sammy! Hold on, Clara! I've got you both!" Ranger pressed his head against Nathan's arm briefly, amber eyes flicking to the back seat as if to remind him that he was not alone in this fight. The snow swallowed the sound of the engine, and the storm pressed on. But inside the cruiser there was no longer despair, only a father's fury, a child's fragile hope, and the silent oath of a German shepherd who had claimed them as his own. The drive through the storm felt endless. Snow hammered against the cruiser, flakes whirling so thick they turned the headlights into 2 glowing tunnels through a wall of white. Nathan gripped the wheel, his jaw tight, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the sliver of road ahead. In the back seat, Clara clutched Samuel, rocking him gently, whispering soft words as if her voice alone could anchor him to life. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, ears perked, his amber gaze shifting between Nathan and the children, his chest rising with steady breaths, as though lending calm to the chaos. At last, the red glow of Willow Creek General Hospital cut through the night. It was a modest building of brick and steel, its emergency entrance lit by buzzing floodlights that reflected off the snow. Nathan pulled into the lot, braked hard, and leapt out. The cold sliced his face, but he barely noticed. He flung open the back door, lifted Samuel into one arm, and pulled Clara close with the other, then ran through the sliding doors as Ranger bounded at his side. Inside, the lobby hummed with fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. Nurses bustled across the tile floors, their sneakers squeaking faintly. At the reception desk stood Nurse Karen Doyle, a woman in her early 50s with auburn hair streaked with silver, tied back into a ponytail. She had broad shoulders, a face softened by years of mothering both her own children and those of strangers, and a voice that could cut through panic with practiced authority. Karen had worked in hospitals since she was 17, when she'd lost her own father to a heart attack and vowed to keep others from slipping away. Her eyes widened as Nathan rushed forward. "Help, please! My son has a fever. He can't breathe right." Nathan's voice cracked with urgency. Karen gestured quickly. "Room 3, let's go." She snapped her fingers at 2 aides who moved with swift precision. Within moments, Nathan was ushered into a curtained room. A tall figure swept in, coat swaying. Dr. Evelyn Carter, Willow Creek's pediatric specialist, was in her early 40s, her auburn hair tied into a low bun, her hazel eyes sharp yet warm. She had a lean build, her presence calm but commanding. Evelyn's life had been shaped by tragedy. She had lost a daughter to pneumonia years earlier, and though she rarely spoke of it, the loss had turned her into a physician who treated every child as though saving them might somehow rewrite her own past. "Give him to me," she said firmly, and Nathan hesitated only a fraction before surrendering Samuel into her arms. Evelyn pressed a stethoscope against his chest, frowning at the shallow wheeze. "Fever's high. He's dehydrated. We'll need fluids and antibiotics." She looked to Karen. "Start an IV. Get oxygen ready." As Evelyn and Karen worked swiftly, Nathan pulled Clara close. Her small body trembled, her eyes wet and wide. She buried her face against his chest and whispered, her voice cracking, "Papa, I didn't tell you, because she said if I did she would throw us out. I was scared you wouldn't believe me." The words broke something inside Nathan. He cupped her face, tilting it upward so he could see her hazel eyes. "Clara," he said, his voice shaking, "I believe you. I should have seen it, but I was blind. That will never happen again. I swear it." He pulled her into his chest, his tears falling into her hair as Ranger pressed close, resting his head against Clara's legs, completing the circle of protection. Evelyn adjusted Samuel's IV and glanced at Nathan. "He'll be okay," she said softly. "Children bounce back with care. What matters most now is that he's safe." At that moment, the curtain pulled aside, and Martha Johnson, the Bennett's housekeeper, stepped in. Martha, in her early 60s, was short and stout, with gray hair tucked into a scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Her loyalty to the family had run deeper than words, though fear of Veronica had often silenced her. She clutched her handbag in both hands, her voice quivering. "I came as soon as I heard. Nathan, I'm so sorry. I should have spoken sooner." Nathan turned toward her, guilt flickering across his face, but Martha pressed on. "I saw the way she treated Clara, the way she neglected Samuel. I thought if I interfered, I'd lose my place in the house, but I should have risked it. The children deserve better." Her eyes filled with tears. Nathan shook his head, his voice rough but steady. "We've all made mistakes, but from this night forward, they will never be left unprotected again." He looked at Clara, then at Samuel sleeping more peacefully under the soft glow of machines, and his vow solidified like steel. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the faint hum of the heater. Clara pressed her cheek against Nathan's chest, her small hand gripping his sleeve tightly. Ranger let out a low, satisfied rumble, laying across the floor as though to guard against every unseen threat. Evelyn watched silently for a moment, her hazel eyes softening before turning back to Samuel's chart. In that sterile room, under buzzing lights, a new beginning was forged, not of perfection, but of promises carved from pain. Morning crept over Willow Creek with a pale light, the storm easing but leaving drifts piled high along the streets. At the hospital, Nathan had spent the night in a stiff chair beside Samuel's crib, his head bowed but eyes alert, unwilling to let sleep rob him of vigilance again. Clara curled against his side, one hand resting on Ranger's thick fur. The dog sprawled across the floor, like a sentinel who had claimed the room as his post. Machines hummed gently, Samuel's fever lowering under the care of fluids and medication. For the first time in days, his breaths came easier. When Evelyn Carter returned for rounds, she paused in the doorway. The sight of Nathan bent protectively over his children stirred something deep in her. She had seen fathers vanish under grief, men who numbed themselves with silence or rage. Yet here was one who, though late, had returned with fire in his eyes. Evelyn adjusted her coat, her expression softening. She spoke quietly. "He's improving. With rest and care, your boy will recover." Nathan nodded, his storm-gray gaze meeting hers. "Thank you, doctor, for everything." As the day stretched, Martha Johnson brought fresh clothes and food. She fussed over Clara, smoothing her hair and tucking the blanket around her shoulders. Clara smiled faintly, her voice soft. "Thank you, Martha." The housekeeper's lined face eased, as though forgiveness had been granted without words. Ranger nudged her hand, and Martha chuckled through tears, scratching his ears. "You're the bravest one of us all, aren't you?" she murmured. While Clara and Martha shared breakfast, Nathan stepped into the hallway, his boots echoing softly against linoleum. His mind churned, pulled unwillingly into memory. Years ago, before the bitterness, before the cruelty, there had been a day at Willow Creek Lake. It had been early spring, the water still cold enough to bite. Clara, only 4 then, had chased a kite too close to the bank and tumbled in. Nathan had been frozen for a moment by the shock of her scream, and then, before he could even dive, a woman had hurled herself into the water. That woman had been Veronica Hale. Younger then, her auburn hair long and damp against her shoulders, her heavy frame moving with surprising speed as she hauled Clara to shore. She had wrapped her in a blanket, whispering comfort while Nathan shook from guilt and gratitude. In that raw moment, he had seen Veronica not as a stranger, but as a savior. And when she later smiled at him with painted lips and promises of devotion, his grief-clouded heart, still mourning his wife, who had died of illness, had accepted. He had believed he was giving his children stability, when in truth he was binding them to someone who had only wanted power. The memory left a bitter taste. Nathan leaned against the wall, his hand pressed against his eyes. The man who once commanded authority on the streets had been blind in his own home. He whispered, to himself, "Never again." Back inside, Clara was tracing small shapes on Ranger's fur with her fingers. She spoke in a hush, as though confiding in him. "You came for us when nobody else would. You're not just a dog, you're family." Ranger's amber eyes softened, and he pressed his head into her lap. For a child who had been silenced, the German Shepherd became a confidant who listened without judgment. That afternoon, a volunteer entered the ward. Sarah Whitmore, a tall, slender woman in her late 30s, carried a basket of donated books and blankets. Her blonde hair was tied into a loose braid, her gray eyes steady and kind. Sarah had once been a teacher, but an accident years ago, a car crash that left her unable to have children, had changed her path. She devoted her time now to comforting children at the hospital, her presence calm as a snowfall. She smiled warmly at Clara. "Would you like to pick a book?" Clara hesitated, then pointed to a worn copy of Charlotte's Web. Sarah handed it to her, crouching so their eyes met. "That one's about friendship and bravery. You'd like it." Clara clutched the book tightly, nodding. Sarah glanced at Ranger with an amused smile. "And I think your friend there would enjoy listening too." Nathan watched the exchange, something easing in his chest. For Clara to reach out, even timidly, meant healing was possible. Later, when Sarah left, Clara opened the book and began to read aloud in halting whispers, Ranger's ears twitching as though he were following every word. As evening fell, Samuel stirred, his small hand reaching toward Clara. She clasped it gently, tears brightening her hazel eyes. Nathan sat beside them, one arm draped around her shoulders. He murmured, "You're safe now, both of you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." His voice was steady, but beneath it throbbed a vow carved deep into bone. The hospital room glowed softly under the fluorescent lights. Outside, snow still blanketed the world, but inside, a fragile warmth took root. A father awakening from blindness, a child finding voice through the loyalty of a dog, and the faint promise that broken families could still be mended. The storm finally loosened its grip on Willow Creek, leaving the streets blanketed in white silence. The town stirred cautiously, plows groaning down Main Street, shopkeepers sweeping heavy snow from their stoops. At the hospital, dawn light streamed through the frosted windows of the pediatric ward, painting the room in pale gold. Nathan sat near the window with a steaming cup of black coffee, his shoulders tense though the worst of Samuel's fever had broken. Clara dozed against Ranger's flank, her hand buried in the shepherd's fur, as though tethering herself to safety. Samuel slept in his crib, his breathing steadier, his cheeks no longer flushed with fire. It should have been a moment of peace, yet Nathan's chest carried a weight he couldn't shed. Memories of Veronica's painted smile haunted him, and deeper still was the gnawing certainty that she would not leave quietly. Meanwhile, in the quieter outskirts of Willow Creek, Veronica Hale nursed her anger. She had taken a room at the Birchwood Inn, a weathered boarding house run by Mrs. Edna Croft, a no-nonsense widow in her late 60s, with wiry gray hair and a sharp gaze that missed nothing. Edna had run the inn for decades, her tenants a mixture of drifters, truckers, and the occasional down-on-their-luck local. She allowed Veronica to stay only because rent was paid up front, though she sensed poison coiled beneath the woman's polished exterior. Veronica stared into her compact mirror, reapplying crimson lipstick with trembling hands. Her reflection revealed not confidence, but fury, eyes ringed with sleepless shadows, curls frizzed despite spray. In her mind, she replayed Nathan's thunderous voice, the way he had turned his back on her as though she were nothing. The humiliation festered, growing into a vow. "You'll regret casting me out," she whispered to herself. At the hospital, Nathan was joined by Detective Alan Brooks, a man in his mid-40s with a solid frame and steady demeanor. His dark hair was peppered with gray, his brown eyes observant but kind. Brooks had been Nathan's colleague for years, a man who had stood beside him on midnight raids and funerals alike. He carried the quiet empathy of someone who had seen too many broken families but still believed in second chances. Brooks leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Word's going around town, Nate. Folks know what Veronica's done. Some say she's already sniffing for a way back." Nathan's jaw tightened, his voice low. "She won't come near them again." Brooks studied him carefully. "I believe you, but she's a clever one. And when pride's wounded, it's the dangerous kind of clever. Keep your guard up." Later that day, Clara wandered the hospital hallway, clutching her book, Ranger padding beside her. She paused near the vending machines where Nurse Kelly Ramirez, a young nurse in her late 20s with dark curly hair and warm brown eyes, was restocking supplies. Kelly was lively, with a quick laugh and a kindness that made children relax around her. She noticed Clara lingering and crouched down. "Hey, sweetheart, want a juice box? My treat." Clara nodded shyly, and Kelly handed her one, ruffling her hair. Ranger wagged his tail, sensing the nurse's gentle spirit. That simple act brought a spark of light to Clara's otherwise shadowed world. Nathan, watching from down the hall, felt his chest ease. People like Kelly, Evelyn, and Sarah Whitmore were stitching threads of kindness back into his daughter's life, threads he intended to guard with everything he had. But far from the hospital's warmth, Veronica was already weaving darker plans. At the Birchwood Inn's dim lounge, she met with Mark Sullivan, a man in his early 40s, tall and lean, with slicked-back dark hair and calculating gray eyes. Once a business associate of Nathan's during town contract bids, Mark had been exposed for cutting corners and pocketing money. He carried the bitterness of a man who believed the world owed him, and his raspy voice carried both charm and venom. Mark swirled a glass of whiskey, his long fingers tapping the rim. "You want your place back, Veronica? You'll need more than tears. Nathan's a cop, straight as they come. He won't bend." Veronica's lips curved into a cold smile. "Then I'll make him break. He thinks he's the hero, but every hero has a weakness. His children are his." Mark leaned closer, his eyes glinting. "Careful. Threats like that can't be undone." Veronica's painted nails drummed the table. "I gave him everything, and he threw me out like trash. If I can't have that family, no one will." Back at the hospital, evening fell. Clara sat cross-legged on the bed, reading aloud to Ranger from Charlotte's Web. Her small voice carried warmth into the sterile room, Ranger's ears twitching at every word as if he understood the story. Nathan listened quietly, heart tightening with both pride and regret. He had missed too many moments like this, buried under grief and blindness. He vowed never to miss them again. Yet when the lights dimmed and silence settled over the ward, Nathan stepped outside to the parking lot. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the cold cutting sharp. He scanned the shadows, every instinct in his police-trained body whispering that danger still lingered. Somewhere out there, Veronica plotted. He could feel it like static in the air. Ranger padded beside him, a low growl rumbling in his chest as his amber eyes swept the darkness. Nathan placed a hand on the shepherd's head. "We'll protect them, boy. Whatever comes." His voice was steady, but beneath it lay the storm of a man who knew the fight was far from over. Winter returned to Willow Creek with a vengeance. The sky dim and heavy, snow drifting thickly across rooftops and curling like smoke over the empty streets. The Bennett house, now quieter without Veronica's sharp tongue, felt almost like a refuge. Nathan had brought Samuel home from the hospital with Clara's hand tightly in his, promising himself never again to leave them vulnerable. Ranger trotted through the rooms with steady vigilance, ears flicking at every creak, his black and silver fur brushing the furniture as though he were marking the space as his domain. It was on one of those evenings that Martha Johnson, the loyal housekeeper, noticed something wrong. Martha, short and solid in her early 60s, had eyes like sharpened glass from years of watching people too closely, a habit born of surviving an abusive husband decades ago. She had developed a sixth sense for danger, and when she stepped outside to fetch firewood, her heart skipped. Snow lay untouched except for a line of footprints by the fence, long, narrow, deliberate. She bent low, the lantern light trembling in her hands, tracing the marks with her breath fogging in the cold. They weren't Nathan's boots. They weren't hers. When she brought the news inside, Nathan crouched at the threshold, Clara clinging to his arm. "Not ours," he muttered, brushing his glove over one print. Ranger growled, hackles rising, his amber eyes scanning the tree line, as though he could already smell the intruders. Nathan squeezed Clara's shoulder. "Stay close tonight." But fate had other plans. The next night, Nathan was called away unexpectedly. A late patrol on the far side of town needed extra hands, and duty demanded his presence. He kissed Clara's head, brushed Samuel's cheek, and told Martha, "Lock every door. Don't open for anyone." Ranger paced the doorway as if protesting, but Nathan's voice was gentle. "Watch over them, boy." The cruiser's headlights disappeared down the snowy lane, leaving the house vulnerable. Midnight drew close. Inside, the fire burned low, shadows stretching along the walls. Clara read softly to Samuel, Ranger curled at her feet, Martha knitting in her chair. The peace broke with a sharp crack of glass. The back window splintered, snow gusting in, and shadows poured through. Two men entered, their forms dark against the storm. Todd Avery moved first, a wiry man in his late 30s, hollow cheeks, eyes too sharp and hungry. He wore a ragged parka, his hands scarred from years of petty crime and backroom fights. Todd carried himself like a man who had nothing left to lose and would take what he wanted regardless of cost. Beside him loomed Calvin Ross, taller, heavier, his shaved head gleaming in the dim light. His tattooed knuckles flexed around a crowbar. Calvin had once driven trucks before liquor, and anger ruined his license. He carried regret deep in his eyes, but greed and fear of Todd chained him to this path. Clara froze, her arms tightening around Samuel. Martha leapt up, her knitting needles clattering to the floor. "You get out of this house!" she shouted, swinging a heavy candlestick. For a moment, her ferocity startled Calvin, but Todd sneered. "We're here for the kids, old woman. Stand down if you value your life." Ranger erupted, his growl like thunder, and launched himself at Todd. They collided, a blur of muscle and teeth. Todd screamed, blood spraying as Ranger's jaws locked onto his arm. Calvin swung the crowbar with brutal force. It struck Ranger's flank, and he yelped, staggering but refusing to let go. Clara cried out, clutching Samuel tighter. Martha swung again, striking Calvin's shoulder, but his size overpowered her. He shoved her against the wall, her body crumpling to the floor. "Grab them!" Todd snarled, kicking at Ranger until the dog finally faltered, blood streaking his silver fur. Calvin wrenched Samuel from Clara's grip, the infant screaming, while Todd seized Clara by the wrist. She thrashed, her fists beating against his chest, her voice shrill with terror. "Let me go! Leave us alone!" Ranger, panting and bleeding, dragged himself up again, eyes blazing. He hurled himself forward, clamping onto Calvin's coat, slowing the man's retreat. But another blow from the crowbar knocked him aside, the sound sickening as metal struck bone. He collapsed, chest heaving, a growl rumbling still as though promising he would rise again. Snow swirled through the broken window as Todd and Calvin dragged the children into the storm. Martha crawled across the floor, her voice breaking. "No! Not the children!" Just then, headlights cut across the yard, the familiar roar of Nathan's cruiser returning earlier than expected. He stepped out, boots crunching in the snow, his storm-gray eyes instantly narrowing. The back door swung open before him, wind howling inside, glass shattered. Ranger lay bleeding, Martha gasping, and the night rang with the fading cries of Clara, and Samuel carried into the dark. Nathan's chest tightened like iron bands. His voice thundered, "Clara! Samuel!" He dropped to Martha's side, gripping her hand as she pointed shakily toward the woods. Ranger staggered upright, limping, blood marking his fur but eyes still fierce. Nathan's jaw hardened. "We'll get them back." The storm swallowed his words, but in that moment, a father and his dog stood against the night, ready to chase into the dark. The night air bit sharp as Nathan staggered out into the snow, his breath fogging in frantic bursts. Ranger limped beside him, blood streaking the shepherd's silver fur, but his amber eyes burned with an unyielding fire. Inside the shattered house, Martha sat against the wall clutching her ribs, her face pale yet resolute. "They went north, into the trees," she whispered, pointing toward the dark ridge that loomed behind the property. Nathan crouched, pressing her hand. "Stay here, Martha. I'll bring them back." Martha, though weakened, met his gaze. "You're not alone, Nathan. Call Brooks." He nodded sharply, his storm-gray eyes already scanning the night. Minutes later, his radio crackled with the familiar steady voice of Detective Alan Brooks, who had been his partner through years of midnight raids and tense interrogations. Within half an hour, headlights cut through the snow again, and Brooks stepped from his unmarked car. Brooks was a man in his mid-40s, his solid frame filling the doorway as he entered. His dark hair, peppered with gray, clung damply to his forehead from the storm. His brown eyes carried both warmth and grit, the eyes of a man who had walked through grief and yet still held on to duty like a lifeline. He carried a notebook in one hand, but it was his presence, steady, grounding, that Nathan clung to now. The detective crouched by the broken glass, his gloved fingers brushing over blood drops that trailed toward the woods. Ranger pressed his nose to the ground, sniffing hard, his tail stiff. "He fought them," Brooks muttered, eyes shifting to the shepherd. "And he nearly stopped them." Nathan's voice rasped with fury. "They took Clara and Samuel. I won't rest until they're back." Brooks met his gaze steadily. "Then we move smart. If we rush blind, the kids pay the price." Together they stepped outside, the snow swallowing their boots. The forest loomed ahead, shadows twisting in the moonlight. Nathan tightened his coat around him, his heart pounding like a war drum. Ranger, limping but determined, led the way, his growl low as he traced the scent through the drifts. Back inside the warm light of the living room, Martha struggled to her feet despite the pain in her ribs. She found the old landline and dialed quickly. Her call went not just to the local station, but also to Sheriff Daniel Whitaker, the county sheriff, a tall man in his early 50s with weathered skin, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and eyes lined from decades of battles both in the field and at home. Whitaker was known for his strict sense of justice, shaped by losing his younger brother to drug violence years ago. The loss had made him relentless against crime, but also compassionate toward victims. When he arrived, he placed a firm hand on Martha's shoulder. "You're safe now. We'll bring those children home." His voice carried the authority of a man who had buried pain, but forged it into duty. Out in the woods, Nathan and Brooks moved carefully, Ranger pulling against the lead as he followed the faint trail of footprints. Snow muffled every sound, yet their breath came fast, pluming in the cold. At one point, Ranger stopped, ears pricking. He sniffed at a dropped cloth, a child's mitten, Clara's. Nathan's throat tightened as he lifted it, his hands trembling. "She was here. She's scared." Brooks placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "That means they're moving fast but sloppy. We'll catch them." Further along the trail, they found cigarette butts, still faintly warm, tucked under a tree where the men had paused. Brooks crouched, his penlight flashing over the snow. 2 men, maybe more. One lighter set of steps, must have been Clara dragged. Heavier prints from someone carrying Samuel. His eyes hardened. "They're not professionals. That might save us." Meanwhile, Veronica and Mark Sullivan sat in the dim corner of the Birchwood Inn lounge. Mark leaned back in his chair, his tall frame relaxed, but his gray eyes sharp. Veronica's hands clenched her drink, crimson nails tapping furiously. "They should have been here by now," she hissed. Mark smirked, his voice raspy. "You hired thugs, not soldiers. Patience. They'll deliver, and then we'll decide how to use those children." For the first time, doubt flickered across Veronica's face, but she crushed it quickly beneath her vanity. "Nathan thinks he can cut me out. He'll learn I don't disappear." Back in the forest, Nathan's voice cut the night. "Clara! Samuel!" His cry was swallowed by the trees, but Ranger surged forward, nose to the ground, ignoring his wounds. Brooks pulled Nathan back. "Quiet! We can't alert them yet." Nathan's fists clenched. His instincts screamed to run, to tear through the woods until his children were safe in his arms. But Brooks's calm voice anchored him. "Trust the process, Nate. We'll bring them back, step by step." They reached a clearing where the trail veered toward an old logging road. Tire tracks cut through the snow. Brooks crouched again, touching the grooves. They had a vehicle stashed, They're moving them further out. He looked at Nathan grimly. We'll need backup. Nathan stared at the dark horizon, his heart pounding, his voice like gravel. No matter where they run, I'll find them. Beside him, Ranger lifted his head, amber eyes glowing in the moonlight. The shepherd barked once, the sound echoing like a vow. The hunt had begun. The next morning dawned cold and brittle, the kind of winter light that revealed every scar in Willow Creek. Nathan stood outside the station, snow crunching beneath his boots, while Ranger sat at his heel, bandaged but alert. The dog's breath rose in small white clouds, his body tense, as though he too sensed the urgency in the air. Nathan's storm-gray eyes were narrowed, his jaw set. The children were still gone, and every minute felt like a blade pressed against his chest. Inside, Detective Brooks spread maps and photos across a long wooden table. Sheriff Daniel Whitaker stood beside him, arms folded across his broad chest, his lined face stern. The sheriff had a booming voice that could still a room, but this morning it was quieter, heavy with the gravity of what they faced. They weren't just after a ransom, Whitaker said. This has the smell of something bigger. We've been hearing whispers about missing kids in counties nearby. I didn't want to believe it, but now... He let the words trail off. Brooks tapped the map with his pen. The tire tracks we found matched older ones from 2 unsolved abduction cases. Same style of snow tires. Whoever's behind this has a pattern. Nathan clenched his fists. So Todd and Calvin aren't freelancing. They're working for someone. Whitaker nodded grimly. Which means they won't keep the children close for long. They'll be moved again. To aid their search, Whitaker brought in Agent Laura Kane, a federal investigator in her late 30s. Laura was tall and lean, her black hair cut bluntly at her shoulders, her sharp gray eyes missing nothing. She wore a wool coat over a fitted suit, her demeanor brisk and professional. Laura had built her career exposing trafficking rings in larger cities, and the grim cases she'd handled left her with little patience for half measures. She introduced herself with a firm handshake. Agent Kane, Department of Child Exploitation. Sheriff called me in when he realized this might be bigger than county lines. Nathan studied her. Her face was striking but severe, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hinted at years of sleepless nights. Laura's tone was clipped but not unkind. I know your children are at the center of this. That makes you valuable, but it also makes you volatile. We do this step by step, or we lose them. Nathan's voice was rough but steady. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me where to start. Later that afternoon, the team followed Ranger into the outskirts where the tire tracks had vanished into an abandoned mill road. The building at the end of it had long since shuttered, its rusted roof caved in, windows broken, graffiti scarring the walls. Ranger pulled at the lead, his nose low, tail rigid. Nathan's pulse quickened. Clara's scarf lay snagged on a piece of wire fencing, the fabric pale against the dark rust. He clenched it in his hand, breath catching. Brooks signaled for silence. They crept around the back, snow muffling their steps. Voices drifted through the broken walls, Todd's sharp laugh, Calvan's lower murmur. Nathan's chest burned at the sound. From the shadows stepped another figure, one Nathan hadn't expected. Ralph Donnelly, a man in his late 40s with thinning blonde hair and watery blue eyes, hunched against the cold in a leather jacket too tight across his frame. Ralph had once been a janitor at Clara's school, a quiet presence no one thought much about. But whispers in town suggested debts, and a drinking problem had pulled him into darker circles. He now stood outside the mill, cigarette dangling from his lips, glancing nervously at the tree line. Laura whispered, "He's a lookout! Amateur, but dangerous if he raises the alarm." Before Nathan could move, Ranger growled low, muscles coiled. The shepherd's amber eyes locked on Ralph. Nathan pressed a hand against the dog's back, whispering, "Easy, boy. Not yet." The plan was simple. Brooks would circle left, Whitaker cover the rear, and Nathan move with Laura toward the entrance. But plans rarely survive reality. Ralph spotted a flicker of movement and shouted, "Cops!" His cigarette dropped, and he bolted into the mill. Chaos exploded. Todd appeared first, face twisted, arm bandaged from Ranger's bite. "They found us!" he roared. Calvin stumbled behind, gripping Samuel awkwardly in his thick arms, the baby wailing. Clara's voice rose above it all, shrill with fear. "Papa!" Nathan's heart thundered. He surged forward, but Laura yanked him back. "Not yet. If you spook them, they'll hurt the kids." Her voice was steel. Whitaker's booming command cut the air. "Sheriff's Department, put them down now." His voice echoed through the crumbling walls. For a tense moment, everything balanced on a knife's edge. Todd's eyes darted, calculating, while Calvin's grip on Samuel shook, betraying his nerves. Clara clung to her brother, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ranger barked sharply, the sound ricocheting like a gunshot, his body straining against the lead. The intruders flinched. In that instant, Brooks signaled, and officers moved into position, weapons drawn but measured. The confrontation had only begun, but Nathan knew this was not the end, only the first step into the web that had stolen his children. The dawn came gray and bitterly cold, a thin veil of frost clinging to the windows of Willow Creek, as if nature itself had frozen in anticipation. Nathan sat in the back of the dimly lit sheriff's office, his hands clasped tightly, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the floor. His body bore bruises from the clash at the abandoned mill, but his heart carried a deeper wound, the uncertainty of whether his children were still safe. Ranger lay stretched out at his feet, one ear folded, the other twitching. The scars across his black and silver coat glinting faintly in the light. The dog's amber eyes never wavered from the door, as though willing the truth to walk through it. Sheriff Whitaker entered, his heavy boots leaving streaks of melted snow across the wooden floor. He carried the kind of weariness in his weathered face that only came from years of burying regrets. "Nathan," he said, his voice rough with both command and compassion, "we've confirmed it. Victor Harland isn't hiding anymore. He's moved your kids to the rail depot on the east end of town. That's his fortress." Before Nathan could respond, Agent Laura Kane stepped inside. The FBI agent in her late 30s had sharp cheekbones, a narrow frame, and storm-gray eyes that mirrored Nathan's resolve. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun, her pressed black coat dusted with snowflakes. Laura had a reputation for being relentless in pursuit, a trait forged by a childhood marred by her father's disappearance into organized crime. She carried herself like a blade, hard, cutting, but forged to protect. "We don't have long," she said firmly. "Harlan's network is fracturing. Some of his men are loyal, others want out. That depot is where he'll make his last stand." Detective Brooks followed her in, his dark skin glistening with melted snow. He held a folder stuffed with reports, his voice calm but taut. "We'll need precision. That place is a labyrinth. Old rail cars, tunnels, storage rooms. If we go in too loud, we'll lose the element of surprise, and the kids could get caught in the crossfire." Nathan rose, his 6-foot frame tense with fury and purpose, his square jaw clenched, his scarred hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the table. "Then we do it right. Quiet, fast, and final." He glanced down at Ranger, who lifted his head, ears pricking at the sound of his master's voice. Sheriff Whitaker studied Nathan, then sighed. "You can't go in alone. We'll form a team. Laura leads from the front, Brooks covers the back. Nathan, you and Ranger stay close to me. If anything happens, your only job is to get those kids out alive." Nathan's reply was low but resolute. "No one is taking them from me again." As preparations were made, the office door opened once more, and Deputy Marcus Hensley entered. Marcus, in his early 30s, was broad-shouldered with sandy hair that stuck out beneath. His patrol cap, his blue eyes bright with both nerves and loyalty. He had grown up in Willow Creek, known for his easy smile and quick laugh, but there was steel beneath the boyish charm. He had once lost his younger sister in a drowning accident, a wound that left him fiercely protective of children. He stepped forward, rifle slung over his shoulder. "Count me in, Sheriff. I'm not letting Harlan's filth breathe the same air as us another day." The plan was set. They would strike at dusk. When the time came, snow was falling in thick curtains, muffling the crunch of boots as the team approached the crumbling silhouette of the old rail depot. The once bustling place had fallen into ruin, its skeletal tracks covered in frost, the warehouse looming like a dark cathedral of forgotten sins. The faint glow of lanterns flickered through broken windows, and shadows shifted within. Laura signaled the group forward, her hand tight around the grip of her sidearm. Brooks scanned the perimeter, his voice a whisper. 2 guards at the north door, another by the loading dock. Nathan's heart hammered as he caught sight of movement inside, small figures huddled in a corner of the vast space. Nancy, her face pale and bruised but defiant, cradled Ethan close. The boy's cheeks were flushed with fever, his thin arms wrapped around his sister. The sight was both agony and salvation. Ranger stiffened, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Nathan placed a calming hand on the German shepherd's head, whispering, "Not yet, boy. Soon." The team moved like shadows. Laura and Brooks took out the guards swiftly, their movements efficient and silent. Marcus covered the rear, his rifle steady despite the tremor of adrenaline. Whitaker pressed a hand to Nathan's shoulder. "Now!" They stormed inside. Chaos erupted instantly, shouts, the clatter of weapons, the rush of boots across concrete. Harlan's men scrambled, some firing, others fleeing. Ranger leapt forward like a streak of silver and black, his teeth sinking into the arm of a thug who lunged toward the children. The man screamed, dropping his weapon as Ranger dragged him down with feral precision. Nathan sprinted across the warehouse, his lungs burning, his eyes locked on Nancy and Ethan. "Daddy!" Nancy's cry pierced the storm of violence. She shielded her brother with her small frame, tears streaming down her face. Harlan emerged from the shadows then, tall and broad, with a cruel smile etched into his weathered face. His gray hair was slicked back, his eyes hard as granite. "You think you can take them from me, Hale?" He sneered, his voice low and venomous. Nathan's fury broke its chains. He lunged, fists colliding with Harlan's jaw, the 2 men grappling like beasts in the snow-chilled air. Years of grief and rage fueled Nathan's blows, every strike a promise kept to his children. Harlan fought back with savage strength, but Nathan's love was the greater weapon. With one final punch, Harlan crumpled to the ground, groaning, defeated. Laura's voice cut through the din. "We've secured the building. The rest are fleeing." Nathan dropped to his knees, scooping Nancy and Ethan into his arms. He pressed his face against their hair, trembling as their small hands clutched at him. "I've got you," he whispered hoarsely. "I'll never let you go again." Outside, the storm began to break. The snow eased into a gentle flurry, and the horizon lightened with the promise of dawn. Ranger padded to Nathan's side, his muzzle flecked with blood, but his amber eyes calm now, watchful. The German shepherd sat tall, as if guarding not just a family, but the fragile miracle of hope restored. As they left the depot, the shattered windows behind them glowed with the rising sun. Nathan turned once, his jaw set, knowing Harlan's empire had fallen. The chains were broken, his children were safe, and for the first time in years, Nathan allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. In the end, this story reminds us that even in the coldest nights, the hand of God can work miracles. A father's love, a child's faith, and the loyalty of a German shepherd became instruments of His grace. In our daily lives, we may not face abandoned warehouses or storms, but we do face fear, loneliness, and hardship. And still, God shows us that no chain is too strong for His mercy to break. If you believe in the power of love and the miracles of God, share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below with the word Amen to show your faith. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage and redemption, and may God bless you and your family always.